This House prefers
political leadership that serves the needs of the people rather than the will of the people.
I'd like to call this House to order. Just to introduce myself, my name is James. I will be chairing today. My numbers. Alright, so just for clarity, the motion is this House prefers political leadership that supports the needs of the people over the will of the people. Alright, I'd like to call the first speaker from Pride Opposition to begin our debate.
I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before I begin my actual speech, I'm just going to ask you a question. Would you want to live in a world where decisions that affect your everyday life are decided by the largest group of people? Or would you rather live in a world that is where the decisions, like through political leadership, are made where it caters for everyone and what people actually need? So with that question being presented to you, I'm just going to greet the floor. Today as proposition, we finally support the motion this House proposed political leadership that serves the needs of the people rather than serving the will of the people. As what we believe that you serve the needs. So, because we believe that governments are not elected simply to obey public opinion, they're elected to make wise and informed decisions that are in the best interest of society. Before I get into arguments and cases that I'm going to be running, I'm just going to be doing a bit of framework and setup. First, I'm just going to run a few key definitions and what does properly mean. My first definition is the will of the people. And what we mean by the will of the people is what is the popular demand of the population, or simply what the majority of society wants. Our definition for the needs of the people is what is genuinely necessary for survival and long-term security of society, even if they are difficult and don't work out in the short term, but it has a long-term effect. And we feel this is better for the general population, having short-term decisions. The metrics which we believe that are the best way to judge this debate would be what is best for society, having political leaders base decisions on needs or wants, which we believe as property, and also what is morally correct and what best represents the people, or what best represents the needs of the people. My case for this debate is that as my first speaker, I'll just be laying the groundwork for this debate and running you through my arguments and generally just giving the context which I've already done for this debate and how it will take place. My second speaker will be doing a part of reinforcing my arguments and running his own case. And my third speaker will just be summarizing the debate, weighing and proving why I should sign the problem. Okay, I'm going to be moving on to our most vulnerable academics. And in this debate, I would say it's definitely minorities, because through our definition of, I'm going to go to my context for a second. The context in which we will classify this debate is definitely developing or third world countries such as a very large country, South Africa, or South American countries as a better example. We think we should focus on these because they're developing countries. They also have very unique political leadership. So we think that we should look at them to kind of just they corrupt, and these leaders are really easy to persuade. So they could just start doing what the people think is best for them, because the people don't know they don't know what's best for them. They aren't We need people who are wise and informed to make the decisions for the people. That's why we believe it would be best to take place in third world and developing countries, and why. Yeah, okay. Let me get back onto area. Idea is minorities because they do not make up the majority of society, which we have already said is what the world will want. It's classified as the majority, what the majority of people want. And the minorities, they do not make up the majority, so obviously they're going to be harmed, because often majorities demand policies that can harm minorities. And like I said, they do not make up the majority, it's just going to end up better. The best, for where this motion is most relevant, is in public health, such as pandemics, environmental protection, such as climate change, and economic policy, and human rights protection, and minority rights. Okay, my first case, or my first argument is that the will of the people is often irrational and misinformed, or short-term focused, or catering to the needs of the country. The fundamental truth is that the public is not always rational or wise in its demands or decisions. Most voters, or people, just general population, are influenced by emotions or manipulation. An example for this is the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people objected, like they didn't want lockdowns, masks, or vaccines. But imagine we hadn't had because the government put in place the lockdown. That was a need. They needed that. The large majority of society didn't want these, and what would have happened about this? Millions and millions of lives would have just died. Lots of lives would have died. Millions of lives. And it's just terrible. And also, okay, my second case is that serving the will of people is often threatened by minorities. I've already kind of touched on this a bit, but I'm just going to expand on that. Majorities, I already said this, that majorities can often demand policies that harm ethnic or religious or sexual groups. History shows us again and again that when we listen to the people's wants across the states, it leads to oppression. The best example of this is apartheid in our very own country. A whole race was just oppressed for almost a decade, which is crazy, just because some British and Afrikaans people served the will of the nation, which at the time was majority white, but the will was to seclude these black people. And just to conclude my speech, leaders must make unpopular but necessary decisions to serve society's best interests or needs, if you will. Thank you.
The panel would like to call the first speaker of opposition to begin next.
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Imagine a world where people's freedom of speech is infringed on, where people don't have the right to speak out. Anyways, I'll begin straight into my rebuttal. So, first of all, what we got from side proposition is that these governments are elected. When they brought up the fact about these governments, they said that they are elected, which actually means that there's the will of the people, because if they are elected, this means that they are living in a democratic state, and in a democracy, how are the governments elected? Through people voting. Therefore, they are going with the will of the people, because the will of the people are the people who have voted these people in. Therefore, you can't have an elected government if you are not serving the will of the people, because the will of the people are these people are the ones that will be doing the voting. that the MBA are the actual people living in the country, as these people... Yes?
If governments are elected by people, or we understand that they're elected by people, then how can they still be bad? Like the ANC was elected by a majority, but it's still not bad.
Just because... I don't really see how the ANC was bad, because the fact is, the ANC are the first democratic, the fully democratic government of South Africa, and have actually developed South Africa quite well. But I want to just also talk about the fact that they also talked about the fact that they told us how the people's wants could harm the people, but they haven't exactly explained what these people's wants are. What about people can want food, people can want electricity. They just came up and said people's wants will harm others, where people's harms can be actually good for the nation. So our burden of proof on side opposition is why it's more important to listen to the will of the people. So our main point here is democracy. People, if we are to focus on the will of the people, it has to be done through democracy, which cannot occur on their side. Democracy is where every person in the country if you are eligible, so past a certain age, you can take vote for who you want to run the country. Each party will give out what they want to do with the country, and people can vote. This gives people a freedom of choice on who they want to vote for. This gives people a good feeling that they've actually been able to affect what's going to happen in the country. Not just the government's in power and they just decide what the needs of the people are. But on our side, these people who know what their needs are and what their wants are, they can see who's best going to suit their needs and what's going to best suit their wants. So this gives them the right to vote. This gives them knowledge that their vote is going towards what they need and what they want. My point is also about the infringement on the rights. In a world where the government is not focused on the will of the people, this is directly infringing on people's rights. People have the right to talk up, have the right to speak out about what they think is injustice. But on their side, and in our world, the government focuses on the will of the people. So when these people speak out, when people believe there's injustice and decide to act out about it, the government will actually listen. Whereas on their side, if there's an injustice, the people have no way of fixing this because the government isn't focusing on listening to the will of the people, but rather the needs of the people. So if these people believe that the needs the government has set out are incorrect, there's no way that they can correct this, as there's no way for their people to speak out and talk out with the government listening to what they say, because the government just sets out the needs, and the people might believe these needs are wrong. And if these needs are wrong, they can't act out and say, no, this isn't right. We don't believe that we need whatever. We believe it's this. They can't speak. The government won't listen. It will just be a waste of energy. But on our side, if people believe there's an injustice, they can speak out. The government will listen because they focus on the will of the people. This is a really important thing, because when people believe that they actually have something to say, they've done something to shift the trajectory of the country, this creates happiness. And happiness is a very important thing. My second speaker will be talking quite a bit on happiness, but just a bit of a thing of what happiness is. Happiness is important because happiness increases productivity, and it creates a better general well-being. And when you have these better productivity and better general well-being, it changes your it boosts things like your economy, and an economy is very important to government, because without the money, how are they going to run the country? If there's a failed economy, then we can't run the country because there's no funds to run the country off of. So it's important because with this extra productivity, it generally makes the country a better place. And yeah, and then they were talking about how the minority minorities wouldn't really have a say, but these minorities also are in the country, therefore they can also speak out. We didn't say that the will of the people is meaning they always will take a vote for it, not always that the minority will always lose. This just means I can like speak out and the government will listen. It isn't the fact that we didn't say that the will of the people is based on, oh, there's 95% people who say this and 5% people saying that. No, the government will listen to what you have to say and then it will decide whether this is actually beneficial to the country because you've been able to persuade it. Even a small minority talking about something to a government that they believe is injustice, the government is still listening to them, whereas on their side, if there's a minority suffering an injustice, the government won't listen at all. Therefore, proving why it is better on our side because it has fulfilled our burden of proof of why it is more important to listen to the will of the people, because this makes sure that all people are heard, all people have a say in what's happening in the country, whereas on their side, it's just breaking the country down because nobody has a say in what happens in the country. That's my time. Thanks.
We thank the speaker for that speech. I'd like to give the second speaker from psychology.
I'll be doing my speech in 3, 2, 1. Moving to the House of Lords, I think I'm going to jump straight into rebuttal over here. Their first point was seem to seem that governments being elected is the will of the people, and I think we're going to argue against this. Because if governments, me personally, I'm not sure about you, but I wouldn't like to have a boss. I don't want a boss, I don't want anyone to boss me around. And I think society as a whole doesn't want people bossing them around or acting as a leader per se. I mean, no one here wants to pay taxes. I think we can all agree on that. Taxes are, for yourself, objectively bad. Should they help your country? That's because of the future. And we feel like the reason that governments are elected is because we need leadership. And that's not actually a will of the people, it's rather a need of the people. People need that leadership. They need people to look up to, and that is why we pay taxes. We don't want to pay taxes. It is probably in the will of the people to not pay taxes, but we need to pay taxes. They also said that people's rules harm others, and how people want food, and if we listen to needs that won't. I'd just like to clarify there that food is a basic human right which would be a need under our definition. I'm just going to quickly clarify how people's will can harm what people's need. During economic crises, public opinions demand quick fixes or unpopular or unstable policies that could set us suspended. Historical case of this was the 2008 financial crisis, where governments cracked under public pressure and they tend to try to make quick fixes without the expert guidance. This actually made the situation even worse. And this is just a quick example. One of your arguments was that governments listening to the needs of the people infringes on human rights, and I'm not sure how it infringes on human rights if basic human needs are human rights, and that is what we are fulfilling in basic human needs. They also said the government wouldn't listen if it only listens to people's needs. Nowhere did we say that people can't protest, people can't argue against this. And then finally, I'd like to. You said that the minority wouldn't minority would have a say in people's laws, and we're going to argue against this because the minority will always lose if the majority does not want them to win. What I mean by that is that if the government comes to you and says that 50% of your money is going to be taken because people in poverty need it more than you, you're most likely not going to vote for that. And if you're following the people's will, that won't happen. If you're following the people's will, that won't happen. That will happen and the people will never be helped. Now on to my first argument. Is that leadership should act in people's best interest. And I'd first like to characterize that public will is unstable, and that is why it's bad. Will the people often reflects what people want in the given moment, not necessarily what they need in the long term. It's also shaped by media, narrative, and emotions. A good example of this would be public support for the US war in Iraq. Popularity surged for this war because the media portrayed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. But eventually, when it came out that no weapons of mass destruction were found, public opinion shifted drastically, looking onto the war as evil. Now, how is the government supposed to do anything if people's will is changing constantly? They can't nail it down to simple things. Compared to people's needs don't change often. Everyone needs food, everyone needs water, everyone needs food, everyone needs water, everyone needs a place to live, everyone needs clean clothes. There's one. Some point of this is that we elect leaders to lead, not vote. Democracy chooses people for their judgments and their skills, not necessarily their ability to be the messenger of the majority of the opinion. If it was that case, we wouldn't need leaders because the public opinion would always be right and rule the people. On to my second point. Long-term well-being versus short-term anxiety. As I said, the people's will is flexible and unstable. If the people's will is listened to, this may lead to short-term emotions, misinformation, which can eventually harm people. In my example of this was the economic crisis, going back to that. So, meanwhile, serving the needs focuses on long-term benefits. And this ties into my first point, because these decisions may be unpopular initially, but they are in need. It prevents the worsening of the situation as we look at it from a long-term perspective. It also allows us to look at the data and expertise and allow the experts to actually decide what is best for society. And what is best for society in the long-term plan? And we want society to live longer, as that is just good in principle. Just to reenact our version of the proof, the benefits of the need of the people heavily outweigh the benefits of the need of the people heavily outweigh the benefits of the will of the people. I'm also going to speak about the fact that political welfare prioritizes the needs of the people, ensure welfare for the long run, even if an unpopular decision is made. Talking back to the COVID situation, millions of people would have died, millions of people would have died if lockdown wasn't put into place. And that would, thank you very much.
Just a reminder that when the bell goes twice, you don't have to end the speech immediately. You still have 15 seconds to wrap up your speech. If there's anything that you want to conclude with. All right. At least for the second speaker from side.
best for society? Well, well, the people in impoverished aren't severely affected because they already have access and the rights to basic education and water and food, whether or not the government focuses on the needs of the people. Because everyone has the right, rejected, because everyone has the right to basic education, which means they can get jobs to support themselves, which makes the people in the middle class and the upper class being neglected because they aren't getting what they desire, which isn't true autonomy and it isn't a true democracy. And a democracy is important because it makes everyone feel important, it makes everyone feel heard, everyone's opinions and decisions get called out, they get heard, which makes everyone feel like they have a place in the country. The happiness of the people are just as equally as important because it can increase productivity and creativity in the workplace, which can lead to the better economy, which can include more imports and exports for the country to evolve and get more technology and more equipment to help them thrive. And the people in poverty, as I said, they already have access to these jobs and the right to education and water and food. So it's in the government's best interest to focus on the middle class and the upper class because of their wants. If they are happier, they will likely improve the economy rate in importing and exporting more materials, more materials which can help the economy and the government taking in money to set the next generation and to provide them and help them. And the people decide who is to become leaders. That's the whole gist of a democracy. And side proposition also stated that people feel as if they need a leader. Yet side proposition has also said that governments also make horrible decisions. That's what the Speaker Opposition said, that the governments also make horrible decisions for the economy that lead to major economic depressions and major falls and economic downfalls in the economy. And if the government focuses on the happiness and the wants and the well-being of the people in the upper classes and the middle classes, it can definitely help increase the economic rate in becoming a true democratic country and a true and help increase people's desires and wants. And the economy can grow faster and quicker with more advanced technology, more equipment, more materials and resources. Rejected. And when people are happy and when they feel as if they are included or if they are working, that just demolishes the chances of there being people who are not happy enough to put all their productivity into their work to increase the productivity of the economy to help the economic rate go up in terms of working well, of working good, doing
and doing what they truly desire. And the people in the upper classes and the middle classes, they already have jobs. They have more availability to these jobs, even though people in the lower classes already have basic rights and basic access to food and water and education, because that's just a basic right, that's just what they need. So if the government focuses on people, on the upper classes and middle classes once, then there is a more likely chance the economy is going to succeed with the lower classes and the people in poverty, even though they already have basic rights, they are not as developed or as like they're not developed enough to be creating to help increase the economy that well. And majority of people who are impoverished, they already have these rights. So the people in upper classes and middle classes, if the government focuses on them, there's a high chance that the economic rate will succeed with them being, with them having, them doing well, because they are happier, they are getting their wants, their desires, and if the government focuses on them, the economic rate will genuinely go up as compared to going down if the government just solely focuses on the needs of the lower class, because the lower class already has these rights and these basic necessities that they already have, like education, food and water, and presentation.
So for what we've seen in this debate, we've seen irrational will versus happiness. We've seen minorities and majorities excluded, everyone gets excluded, versus minorities included. We've seen leadership should act in the best interest of people versus infringement of rights. So the first point that we've seen is our point, which is the wrong point, the irrationality of somebody's will versus sort of their happiness. So we said that somebody's will is often irrational. So COVID. There were a lot of people in the world who didn't want to wear masks. That wasn't their will, that was their want. That was a mass one. That's people who didn't want to wear masks, didn't want to have quarantine, but the government wanted to defend it. They wanted to say, no, we can't listen to your will because it doesn't act in your best interest. Yet they've come up here and said happiness increases productivity, which is false, because they've said that if people's wills are included, then they'll be happy and that'll increase their productivity. They haven't characterized happiness. Stop there. I don't know what fuels happiness. So I'll assume what fuels happiness. Public holidays. That means that 1/365th of the country's GDP is lost every public holiday. And that's a huge number, plus or minus. It may seem like a small fraction, but it's actually very large. And that means that happiness doesn't fuel productivity, it actually takes away from productivity. Again, you need to get able to characterize happiness and what fuels it. So we've also seen minorities and majorities excluded. So we saw this in apartheid.
Are you saying that if I'm depressed, it'll work better?
I'm not saying that if you're depressed you're going to work better. I'm just saying that people's happiness and people's will is often not in the interest of the government and what the government's idea of productivity is. Sure, it's bad to be depressed, but it's also bad to not be productive as a country. So what they've said, it's just a weird one, sorry. We've said minorities and majorities included, we brought the idea of apartheid. Again, this was basically in their will. Somebody's will being fulfilled. The will of one group attacking the majority, another group, And they seem to think that, no, we can defend minorities by defending their rule, by defending what minorities want. But actually, if we defend minorities' rules, we're going to run out of money, because what governments have a very finite budget, especially within the context, the third world context. Governments don't have a lot of money, and they've come up here and they've told us, they haven't given us a counter definition, they haven't given us a counter context. I'll also get into the MBA later, but they've come up here and they've said that we can just include everyone in minorities. But the way I see it, that's exclusion. If you're not giving everyone the same opportunities, that's exclusion. If you're giving different people, again, I haven't characterized it. I don't know if this is building churches only, or building Christian churches only, or building churches and mosques. They haven't characterized this. I don't know really what this looks like. But minorities on their side are actually excluded. So we've also seen leadership should be in the best interest of the people versus the infringement of rights. I'll start with the rights one here, because this, again, they bring up the counter definition, but we said that the needs of people need to be met. Basic needs, basic human rights. They sort of attacked our definition, but also left our definition alone here, because they said that people need a voice. And sure, we need a voice, but we get a voice, even in an economy or a country where our needs are met. There is a voice. There are things like Twitter, Instagram, whatever, you can still speak. And it's not like we've completely blocked people from getting through to the government. It's not like the government adjourns in one big Kremlin and then they just give out pieces of paper that say, this is what the government wants to fulfill. We're not exactly fulfilling the government's will all the time. We're not excluding the people. Again, they said the ANC was, I gave the ANC, they denied that the ANC was responsible for this, but they also said that the ANC was good and that they brought lots of progress to the country. They brought not lots of progress to this country. Again, I'll get into that later. But they brought up lots of very good points like that. So back onto my key points now. Again, they said the ANC is good. The ANC have not brought good to this country. That was a very strange point that they brought up. The ANC may have been what the people wanted, which is what we see on our side and their side, the democracy still exists. But they haven't fulfilled the people's will, even though they promised to fulfill the people's will, which actually is an interesting point that of rebuttal that could be brought up of corruption. A lot of countries are simply way too corrupt to function. And in a third world setting, countries would not have countries that fulfill will in third world countries would have more opportunities for corruption and more bureaucracy. And countries that simply fulfill need basic human rights, that's what they should be focusing on, won't have as much opportunities for corruption. So again, we got no NA, I brought up the POI, and they seem to be, so I don't really know what the argument for, I know what they can bring up the context and bring up the metrics, so again, it's a bit difficult to deal with. They haven't brought up the counter definition, so again, they're pointing to it's infringement of rights doesn't actually work because it just attacks our definition, it doesn't work our definition, again, they bring up the counter definition. Our points protect the MBA, so our points protect people in third world countries, our definition that Judith bring up. Our points protect people in third world countries. You, on the other hand, have simply assumed that people in third world countries would have access to a lot of things that they actually don't. So you assume that they have lower classes access to basic rights. Again, this is brought up in our context. You've said that you've kind of ignored them, but you've also said at the same time that they are included in their third speech. You said that our will serves middle and upper class. You said that the will would serve them, but you've also kind of ignored the lower class and said that they would have their rights, they'll have everything there, which again they don't. Most people in the third world country are lower class, so sure, people in upper middle class in those countries do tend to have the things they need, often living in a very first world standard there. But a lot of people are actually third world in those countries, and they are IDA. You said IDA is minorities in countries, minorities, again, a lot of the time being poor people in third world countries. You have to really point that out. And again, you don't need luxuries to be happy. They seem to think as well that they're trying to. I don't want to make it seem like we're saying that it's okay to be impoverished, because again, we're trying to defend people who are less able here. But they seem to think that the people on the bottom always want to climb their way to the top, and that there will be sort of a mechanism for them to do this, but it actually won't. To get advanced, and it doesn't work with the metrics in this debate. And getting back to metrics, we feel that we filled our metrics and we have won these points. Again, we won the clashes of. We won these clashes. I said about we won these clashes, but we fulfilled our metrics again of best for society, it's best for society to have a lead, especially.
Thank you for that speech. With those for a second.
I'll be starting my speech in 3. Okay, I have some rebuttals to side off here. So in this debate, we've gone through elections and how people have a right to vote on who is in government or who's in parliament, right? But on side proposition, you can't have people who have expressed their opinion on who they want in parliament if you don't have elections, if governments are only catering to what people need and not what they want to see in their country. And so, you also wrote this point about how on your side you're not stopping protests, you're not stopping people speaking out. We're not saying that you are, we're just saying that the government's going to be ignoring what these people are saying once they start protesting, once they speak out about something that is harming them. Let's say a basic need or a need that is being influenced by the government isn't really being executed properly and they have a problem with it. How is the government going to fix that problem or create a better solution if I don't come up here and start saying, no, what you're doing was wrong, you need to fix it in this way in order for it to actually help me? How will they do that if they don't get into the will of the people? Another rebuttal I have for side proposition is that links to what I was previously saying, is an ill-informed government. So once governments go into power and they have this, once they're voted into power, as proposition mentioned, how that cannot be done, you start, we've seen it in our country during this time, you start to become power hungry. You start, once you get into politics, once you've been voted into government, you start having this idea that, oh, I'm a leader of this country, you know, you're going to do what's best suited for what you think is best and not what actually is best for the country. You forget about the policies that you stated, or you don't execute the policies you had in a way in which it could affect more people, or in a way in which it helps everyone. But you start focusing on your narrative, and if you don't have people that speak out and speak up, not take it, if you don't have people that don't protest about these certain issues, or don't hold the government accountable for these mistakes that they're doing, then how are you going to live in a country that you're happy with? I won't spend any much time on my rebuttal, but now we're speaking on the clashes that I identified in this debate. So there's 3 main clashes that I identified in this debate. Democracy versus a type of autocratic run country, which is then therefore an informed government. We spoke about how democracy is important, how people are given a voice, a chance to speak on what they believe should happen, the changes they should see in their country, how certain things should be executed, how they would basically live in a country which they're happy with. But you can't have that if you have an ill-informed government who doesn't listen to the will of the people, listen to what people want, but a government that is running based on how they think it should be run and not how the country believes it should be run. And now, continuing with that clash, you came up here, spoke about how you're not silencing these voices, how people can still protest every now and then, these quick, short protests about things they don't believe is right, which I explained in my rebuttal how that cannot happen, and so therefore that point falls and therefore fosters what I was speaking about an ill-informed government, and how an ill-informed government is not what you want to see. Let's take a few autocratic run countries, such as Russia. people, Russia is an autocratic country. They focus on the needs of the people and they don't really listen to what people actually want. People aren't happy there. They may have a strong economy, but people aren't happy there, which leads me to the second clash that we've identified, happiness versus the minority being accounted for. So we spoke about, say again?
Who's to say that Russians are not happy?
It's been stated that Russians are not happy because the government doesn't listen to them. Putin doesn't listen to what people say. He's like, I want it this way, so I'm going to have it this way. So we spoke about happiness versus minority being accountable. And now I'm going to explain to you why that point falls flat, because if you don't have a government that listens to the will of your citizens, you will have both minority and majority who won't have a say or a voice in how your country is run. Okay, so on our side we spoke about how happiness is important. Happiness increases productivity, which you kind of fail to, which you scrolled a bit. What my speaker came up here and was talking about is how happiness gives you more of an incentive to want to work harder, to want to earn money, to be part of society. And you can't do that if you're living in a country in which you are not happy, in which you feel like you're working for something that won't benefit you. Because at the end of the day, let's be honest, people are selfish. If something doesn't affect them or something doesn't directly benefit them, they're not really going to care. So that point kind of falls flat. And our last clash that I will quickly speak about is how my second speaker came up here and spoke about true autonomy, and speaker came up here and spoke about long-term will versus short-term will. My first speaker came up here and spoke about the type of long-term will that you get, or the short-term will that is said to have on-side propositions, such as people who want things such as, tax reduction or, decreasing inflation, those type of wants. The government, like you said, the government isn't going to necessarily bend over and listen to that. And no government can promise you that. That's what I can say. But we have fulfilled our burden of proof of why it's more important to listen to the will of the people, and that's why we have won this debate, I think.
All right, thank you for that speech. Can I please call the opposition speaker, the opposition reply speaker to speak this?
I'll begin my reply in 3, 2, 1. Alongside opposition, we were burdened to prove why it's more important to listen to the will of people. Throughout our whole debate, we made points like why it's important to have a democracy and why it's important to have freedom of speech, which directly links into our burden of proof and proved it, like how freedom of speech means that the government will listen to them, it will create more happiness. And then we also came up and spoke about how this is an important thing. On side proposition, they came up and said how happiness won't really help incentivize them to increase productivity and stuff. But my third speaker came up and proved why it would actually, because you wouldn't want to do it if there was no reason for it. And then on the side proposition, they kept talking about this government and how it would be elected. Throughout my speech and my third speaker's speech, we came up and proved why there can't be a leader that's been elected because that's only available in a democracy, and how they can't have democracy without listening to the will of the people. So that point, so how they are led falls flat. We don't know how they did that. And then, so we've come up and we've fulfilled our burden of proof of why it's more important to listen to the will of the people. And they also came up and spoke about how people can talk out and how they can have freedom of speech. Then my third speaker came up and told us how it can't work because that's listening to the will of the people. Therefore, we have proved why our side is more beneficial to our MBA, the people of the country, and why we create a better place for people to live in. Thank you.
All right, after that speech, could we please call Proposition 5 to conclude our debate?
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. After my reply speech, I'm just going to say what they said. They said they thought they'd be OP, even though they didn't even have one. They said they showed why it's important to have democracy, which is not showing why it's important to follow the people's will. They also said why freedom of speech creates happiness, which is also not why following the people's will is important. They also said that Russians can't be happy. They actually haven't said why being under an autocratic government creates unhappiness, because they didn't have matrix. Overall, I think we improved. Overall, I think in our best case scenario, we have a world where people's needs are met. People's basic needs are met, even if you don't have the basic luxuries. You're guaranteed to have the basic human rights, such as water, food, etc. Compared to their world, where these basic human rights are maybe not fully fulfilled. We've proven how our MBA is protected, showing how we'll give these basic needs to the MBA, which was the third world countries, people in poverty. And we also proved that we also proved how they said that we said elections were not necessary, even though they said that we said elections were not necessary on that side. We never said why it can't be. They also said that people can't express their opinion. We did rebut this case, saying that people can. They said our government would ignore basic human opinion, and they haven't actually shown us why our government would ignore people's opinions. They haven't shown why we can't listen. It's in the government's best right to listen to the people's opinion, stand up. Overall, I think we have quite clearly dominated the case, because they have not actually shown why following the people's will following the people's will is better than following the people's needs, as all they've really said is that following the people's will gives people already in an upper class even more things, which do they really need? Not really. Doesn't actually give the people who do need stuff, i.e. people in poverty, anything. And yeah, that's basically what it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone for the debate. Could both teams please cross the floor and shake hands while the panel steps outside.
Oh my gosh, you're doing the hard thing.
As long as I'm in the shot, right? So, just frame the shot. Once you finish, once you finish it, just lock it down, and then when you need to change it, you need to change it. So then you stand up and lock it. So once you
lock. Oh, that's lock. Oh, this is lock.
making it loose.
Oh, okay.
So once you frame the rough shot, just quickly lock it, and then on the horizontal as well, so it doesn't move. Sure.
Easy.
But you don't can't. Yo.
Yeah, this is lock, and then you open, and then open lock.
So twisting this will stop it from moving in. Twisting this will stop it from falling. And over again with the stack. Okay.
Yes, you guys have to. Does I have to watch you?
Yes.
I believe in you guys.
Oh, right. I'm never gonna do it. I didn't mean to. Okay. Yeah.
Is she the projector one?
Yeah.
Would not even wouldn't even miss the it's a joke that matters. Okay, to be fair, I directed that. To be fair, no, I directed that at I directed that
That'll be like what? I don't know what's so good. No, but I would rather have
which Sophie's better. Kingswood's so good. And guess what? It's so good. And it's my first one. And guess what? We went to see the countries. No! Now we're not going to be so deep.
I don't want her to come. Because mountains are like this is like the rocks are all probably set up before you probably more than it's but it actually wasn't separated. The centimeters
You will see it on TV. So the sports boys are going to be wearing tapes and music bands.
Alright, so I'm going to just start with the panel's general. I'm going to just start with the panel's general tool, and then I'll explain how we saw the debate go, what we agreed to hear from both sides, and why exactly our call went the way it did. So as a unanimous decision for the panel, the debate was won by the proposition. Alright, so just going into, I think, what the main contentions or pushes from both sort of sides were. And I think just to start with proposition, right, I think we get this idea that, firstly this idea about sort of why the will of the people is irrational, why it's short-sighted, why it's emotional, and thus kind of explaining why it's not something that we should listen to if we want good sort of policy outcomes, and then sort of further ideas about minorities and their role within sort of the will of the public and sort of how we best protect them. I think sort of one of the the best sort of contention that comes out of opposition is this idea about sort of democracy, right? And contending, is proposition really legitimate at achieving sort of democracy, right? We think that opposition does prove this quite well, right? And we think that argumentation is substantive enough for us to accept the idea that proposition is not actually advocating for democracy, right? I think, however, where proposition does win is then, even if we do take this sort of characterization at opposition's best and we give them full credit for it, right, proposition still points out the flaws with a democratic model, right, and points out why the benefits they're trying to get don't necessarily need democracy to be achieved. And conversely, I think the main issue with opposition's case being there are these sort of vague outlines of benefits that democracy can bring us, right, but we don't think they are proved as solidly as the harms that opposition prove of, right? So proposition comes up and they push this idea of the average person, the average voter is irrational, they're short-sighted, they vote on emotion, right? And they prove very well in later speeches how this leads to bad policy outcomes, right? Well, opposition's main push is this idea about sort of happiness, right? And if we give people access to democracy, their happiness increases. And I think they prove quite well the sort of downflow, the effects of this happiness, right, on productivity, on the economy. The big problem that we have with the panel in this, and as I was pointed out by proposition, is that there's not a great deal of work done to connect democracy itself and people's happiness, right? We feel that this is an assertion, and this generally sort of weakens a lot of the matter brought by opposition, right? And then I think in contrast, just to conclude, proposition does a very, very solid job of explaining, you know, here's why the will of the people is bad, again, going through rationality, going through protection of minorities, right? And just this idea that, I think they create enough doubt in the idea that the will of the people ought to be the way that the government is structured, and I think opposition doesn't do enough work to defend why the will of the people could be valuable, and on that basis, proposition wins by just kind of outlining why the will of the people itself is not necessarily something valuable to listen to. Yeah, thank you. Oh, if any of the speakers want personal feedback, they can come to either myself or my family.
Like why we trip time and like all of them.
Yeah, no, we don't do replies.
Yes, I agree with that. People like we all the we're very Rio and I were just I was studying, but yourself wasn't Maybe she meant for this one. Yo, you're gonna have 3
Time.
vou ficar mais de fome. A gente vai acolher.
Oh, like you say when you ask And then you didn't even tell me that the lighting was terrible.
Shane, this one's cute.
Wait, is it not? I'm back.
Wait, how do we go back?
Well, which one?
This one.
There might be a few questions of interest there.
Oh, look how pretty.
Wow.
Look how pretty.
I feel like, yeah, well, it depends. Like, how much of Kingswood is like compared to all of them. Okay, then I can be a bit more. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's it.
You're 14.
Yeah,
You're 14 and you're the same. No, which means by the time she was by me, or even us by you, she would have been third year uni. Or second year uni. No. You see? And you see, the things that we struggle with, right? This is functional, right? So you're going to grade 8. That's
actually anything that thinking would be. I don't
Yeah, I started thinking about
hand over to the adjudication panel. James will be our chair.
Alright, just some housekeeping to start. Can everyone hear this?
Yes.
Okay. I'll then like canvas themselves.
Hi guys, my name is Arisa. I coach the
Hi, Lisa.
My name is Sarah. I also coach the
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
The motion for this House is this House supports the use of sanctions as a primary tool of international diplomacy. Right? Alright. Can I please call the first speaker outside of reading another bill?
I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2. Okay, so the problem we have here today is that we're trying to solve the issue of countries committing inhumane acts and how we plan to stop them. Right? On-site proposition, we're here to prove why we think sanctions would be a more effective and legitimate way of handling international diplomacy. Okay, diplomacy. Right. Okay, so I'm going to break down the motion a bit. By primary, we want to prioritize this. We understand and acknowledge that there are other ways of being able to help. However, we think that this is the best way, and that is what we're here to prove. Okay. Then we have international diplomacy, practice of conducting relative between countries and other actors on a global stage, including through means of negotiation. Okay, just for some clarifications and context, right? So sanctions, we don't believe they are tying down only solely to trade. We believe that they are diverse, they come in many different forms, economically, culturally, socially. Then just a clarification between sanctions versus boycotting. Sanctions are international and they're centralized, whereas boycotts we consider more they're individual and they're decentralized. Okay, we don't support the mishandling or misuse of sanctions, and we think it's rare that these happen because normally these sanctions are taken by professionals in this field. Okay, for this debate, we need both sides to concede that sanctions are put on countries that have done something inherently bad or something that you don't approve of as a country who's putting and we don't have to, we are not, because it is sport, we don't have to prove that all sanctions are working, just the majority, and that's why we believe we should do. Okay, for a bit more context and a little more clarification, the two worlds which we're arguing here is Prop's world, which is closest to the status quo, which is a world where sanctions are primary, and a world where countries are more reliant on trade, and they're more reliant on trade than before. Okay? And currently, countries prefer to use sanctions, and we'll talk about this a little later. What are the reasons for countries preferring sanctions? We have reasons behind this, right? Our actors for this debate are who are we sanctioning? Okay? So we're sanctioning people who have done something inherently bad, or something that threatens the sanctioning countries, the country choosing. These are normally third world countries, or countries that come from the southeast, right? Some examples of like inherently bad things would be like Iran building nuclear weapons, or Syria's government using chemicals against.
Please speak up. Do you think countries always go to war for legitimate reasons?
Do I think countries always go to war for legitimate reasons? No, but we're not saying sanctions don't always take place within legitimate reasons. However, also you are called out as a country when it's countries always have reasons. When you consider legitimate is very varying. Every country believes that their reason is legitimate, otherwise they would go to war. Other countries have different opinions on whether that reason is legitimate. We can
can identify something that is completely illegitimate as something that is not like worth. Okay. Then we have the people who are sanctioning. These normally Western countries or first world countries, right? They want the chosen country, the country they're sanctioning, to stop whatever they're doing, and they don't want anything too radical. We understand that they're also selfish and beneficial reasons that they might be sanctioning in this case as well. Okay. The civilians of the sanctions. They're often hurt by the country's actions or whatever they're doing that is the bad thing, and they want change. We understand that out of all these civilians, who are the ones who are most affected. Right? Okay. Our arguments for this debate, and my first argument will be on effectiveness, which we talked about. My second will be talking about legitimacy and long-term, and touching on long-term stability. Okay, the effectiveness of sanctions. What is an effective solution? A solution that causes the least harm to our actors while putting an end to the problem, or what is like closest to the end. Okay? How do we say that sanctions are effective? First of all, when an effective sanction needs coordination. How do we get coordination? Through secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions are a means of when China is trading with Russia, for example, we sanction China so that they can no longer trade. How is this effective and how is it effective? Well, because they are no longer trading with Russia, it solves the problem of there being just one country not trading with Russia, which, I mean, we can argue doesn't affect, depending on who this country is, doesn't affect Russia in a big way. By using secondary sanctions, you can create an idea where more countries are threatened. This works because China doesn't also want to be sanctioned by the USA, and so therefore they no longer trade with Russia, right? Okay, then we have targeting. If we use the example of the Russian-Ukraine war and the sanctions that are going on there, we can also use like the Russian oligarchs, who are the super rich people in Russia, who influence the government, right? At the moment, they're freezing assets, they're using international money. Okay? So what do both of these things do? They slow down and critique the operation, right? So again, we look at Russia, they've slowed down a lot. It was supposed to be like a 3-year thing, but it's gone on for a long time, right? They don't, even if it don't stop, it's more likely for negotiating for immunity and concessions as it creates pressure, right? Again, if we go back to the idea of these being mostly third world countries that are facing this, third world countries are more reliant on first world countries for trade and for things like this, right? Okay. And we are very dependent in this one day on pages. Okay. So even if we concede that sanctions aren't working or that they aren't effective, why is it that the possible solutions that they could offer are not effective? Okay, first let's look at the possible solutions they can offer. They can give us military. We just had military results in long wars. If we give an example of Afghanistan, they could give us the ICJ arresting world leaders. A lot of the time, the ICJ can't connect out to power, and we have leaders just not showing up when there's a war on their name, like Vladimir Putin. We have humanitarian aid, which is often interfered with and results in a military, for example. That's why we're saying there's a reason the status quo is as it is, there's a reason we currently prefer sanctions, and we're saying that the most likely scenario where we're not having sanctions isn't actually any action at all, because the government doesn't want to take the steps of military involvement. They've seen what's happened before. They've seen what's happened with like the Cold War. They don't want to have these things again. They don't want to be wasting resources, and they don't want to draw attention to themselves in a negative light. Anything else? Okay. In conclusion, I've given you why we are legitimate, why we are effective, and why often not legitimate, not effective, and how we
are going to be affected by these sanctions, and how they are going to respond to these sanctions, and whether or not that is actually going to affect them in a positive way. Right, now, let's just take a look. They did great contextualization. We just want to say that they did say that sanctions are not exclusive to trade and also include the economic, culture, and social aspects. We tell you that it's most likely to be economic because that is the most influential way that sanctions could work. However, in my case, it's still applicable to both, so we would still have the same impact there. Right. They also bring up this idea that it is rare that sanctions are going to be misused. It's unlikely that they're going to be abused, even though in any situation there is going to be something that goes wrong. Now, let's speak about the abuse of sanctions. Right. Proposition comes up here and says that sanctions are going to be used responsibly, that they'll only be used when a country has done something wrong and when they think that there's a need to solve something. Right. And yet they also come up in an answer to a POI. They say that each country has their own idea of what is right and wrong. They come up and say that, oh, actually they have their own ideas of whether something is legitimate or not. This means that there isn't a clear defining line of whether or not sanctions should be imposed, meaning that it would therefore be fair to say that countries are likely to abuse said sanctions because they have their own ideas of what legitimacy in applying sanctions is. Therefore, it is likely for them to be used irresponsibly, and this can have very detrimental effects, such as causing economic instability, harming the most vulnerable actor, which ultimately does not achieve the most vulnerable actor's incentive, and does not provide a burden of proof of actually having sanctions be effective, because there is no criteria for when these sanctions can be used, and the criteria that is given is something that is completely subjective, and something that, if it has such effects as they say it does, can be incredibly detrimental if it is misused, which is most likely will be, because there are no set rules about it. No. Then they come up with this idea of efficacy. This doesn't directly clashes with my case, but I'm going to touch on it now. Ultimately, as I already said in my opening, they are not taking a look at how this affects two different kinds of government, democracies and dictatorships. On one side, we have democracies who they do care about their citizens, they do care about whether or not their citizens have money, whereas on the other side, dictatorships do not, and that is my entire case. Now, let me just move on to my framing and setup so far. So, our burden of proof today is to prove to you that sanctions are not effective enough and are likely to be harmful if they are used primarily in international diplomacy. We are not here to prove that alternatives are perfect, just that sanctions are not good enough to be supported. However, we will be giving them alternatives and weighing up how these alternatives are exponentially better than sanctions. No, thank you. I'll be speaking on the efficacy and outcomes in democracies and dictatorships, and my second speaker will be speaking on the point of de-dollarization. Now, let me move on to my positive matter. A multiple actor on both sides is the citizens. Their incentive is safety. They want peace, they want a stable economy, they want money, right? All that regular stuff. Now, their capacity to do so is that they cannot do this under sanctions, especially if they are living in a dictatorship, but also if they are living in a democracy. And once again, and then also the peace is not of good quality. They are not achieving long-term peace because they are not actually achieving change. Now, let's take a look at the two types of countries that I mentioned before. So, we have our democracies, right? Their incentive is to protect the people. They have a mandate to the people, they have accountability to the people. Their capacity to protect the people is that sanctions target people. The sanctions are not a target, they're a target directly on the people, they affect the people. And since they have this accountability to the people, it's likely that democracies are going to change and help the situation, and the sanctions are going to work with democracies. However, we do not care about that. We care about dictatorships, and let me tell you why. So, an incentive of dictatorship is power. They want power, they want to gain as much power and influence as possible. Their capacity to do so is they do not have any accountability to the people. If their people lose their lives, if they cannot afford food, they do not care because they are not voted in and out of government, right? They will keep doing whatever they are doing by whatever means possible to achieve this power that they want. And now, this is moving on to why it is legitimate to care about the effectiveness. Effectiveness as a dictatorship of a tool in dictatorships, especially. Now, 28% of countries are dictatorships, namely Russia, China, Saudi Arabia. What's important about those? The biggest country, the biggest economy, and one of the richest countries in the world, right? They obviously hold an incredibly large influence on a global scale, not only economically, but also socially and politically, right? This makes them dangerous. Why? Because as we already stated, panel, they do not have any accountability to their people. They do not care about the most vulnerable actor, which is their people, their citizens. And therefore, they have no incentive
or use a tool primarily that will attack dictatorships specifically. Because sanctions clearly do not work, because sanctions target the people, and they evoke change by harming people. If the recipients, which are these dictators, do not care about their people, there is no effectiveness. It is completely ineffective to impose sanctions on them because they will not work. The entire premise, which is harming the people, is not going to work in a dictatorship, right? What is the outcome of this? This can be an incredibly detrimental situation because there is nothing stopping them from continuing their conflict, from continuing their humanitarian crimes, from continuing the war. Because they do not care about the people. They do not care about what they're going through. They just care about gaining power, which is their incentive. And this is what makes them so dangerous, and this is why we want to find solutions that target them, and sanctions is not this. We need to stop the actor that harms the most normal actor, and sanctions are not the way to do this, right? If sanctions are the primary tool for international diplomacy, dictatorships will not be stopped effectively, and this will increase the harm because they maintain unchecked power. For example, we can take Russia's military operations. One of their biggest and most famous military operations is literally the idea of they can't kill us all. They send their ranks running forward of the trenches in World War II, just so that someone will get through. They do not care, they are willing to do whatever they want in power. I'll take it away.
If you believe that dictatorships don't care for but we have propaganda, we see this within dictatorships, they want to keep their people happy. Do you think the people would be happy if they are being negatively affected by these sanctions?
It does not matter. Even if certain dictatorships think want to make their people happy, at the end of the day, they have no incentive to keep their people happy because they hold no accountability to their people. It does not matter, and you cannot say that every single dictatorship, or at least the dictatorships we have mentioned, are going to care about what their people think and are going to care about keeping them happy, because the entire nature of a dictatorship is they have no accountability to the people. Now, for the second string of my arguments, which is the long-term detrimental effects. So, firstly, we have the physical effects, the practical effects. Sanctions only work after about 2 or 3 years of them being implemented, right? This is a lot of time for one, an escalation in war, 2, an increase in the crisis, and ultimately just an overall increase in harm to the most vulnerable actor. The impact of this is that sanctions provide a blatant opportunity for escalation of conflict, and is not something worth supporting as the primary tool of mitigating conflict. It provides an opportunity, which is very likely given the nature of war, which is keep fighting until we win, to harm the most normal actor. They are totally supporting something that blatantly says, okay, we are giving it a room to harm the most normal actor. And 2 or 3 years is a very big thing. Affording 100 Cokes to only now avoiding 2 Cokes, of course to still maintain that power by adjusting to how these democracies are being conducted. Okay, cool. So what's the structure of my speech? Firstly, I'm going to be doing some just basic case clarification. And then secondly, I'm going to be doing my rebuttal mixed with some strategic thoughts from side opposition. And I'm going to be going into my argument, which directly clashes with the first argument of legitimacy. Okay, cool. So what do we see being, I'm going to use some actors now. What do we see being the main actor consideration in this debate? We see the most vulnerable actors in these, all these developing dictatorship economies are vulnerable poor people. That's who we have in mind here. And the issue there is that there's an alternative world of, we have other primary forms of imposing on poor people. But we think that even if you tariff places, even if you go to war with these countries, poor people are always going to be impacted. So where are we telling you on the base level? Sanctions already limit the harm that we put onto vulnerable groups within these places. Because we think sanctions targets them first, because now I can't afford a pair of pants. And we think that war will obviously target them because rich people and middle class can flee, while the poor are unable to get themselves economically out of places. So already sanctions impose a moral barrier and an economic barrier. And of course, school in the short time you're not going to be able to afford maybe the pair of pants I spoke about earlier. But in the long term, we see that there's a genuine change to quality of life, and my first speaker agrees with her argument. And cool. And now, what do we need to clarify in terms of what's this way? In terms of the nature of sanctioned states? Now, we need to note that side, do a very dodgy job at characterizing this. They tell us that they're going to, they never treated you. But what is the nature of sanctioned states, and what do they look like? This can look like very narrow sanctions that we see on places like Russia, and this can look like very broad sanctions as we see on places like Cuba. We don't think that these places in and of themselves are going to be corrupt and whatever, because we think that democracies have experts in them, the UN has experts, and we see that they have the knowledge in the background and know how to impose sanctions that will work effectively. Already we see that there's a gradual change towards the attitude towards Russia because of these sanctions. Sure, they were imposed 2 years ago, but versus the tariff, we think that these are way better at informing people and informing whole groups of countries that, hey, this is a bad actor, we should be siding with them. Okay, cool. Now I'm going to go into my rebuttal, and I'm going to show us the impact of all the points that they said. So they gave a POI to my first speaker about, is it always legitimate to go to war? We answered, no, obviously not every case is legitimate, but we think that in the case of sanctions, we're able to have a bit more clarity and a bit more information, as I said earlier, because this is a system developed by economists who are going, where are the risks of this, where are the outcomes of this. We think it's a more thought through process than most wars are. Secondly, they asked about the abuse of sanctions and that there's no clear line. Note, I'm just going to clarify that, just using the example they use, democracies versus dictatorships. Democracies already have a very clear line about what they want to do. They're populists, they want to uplift people, they want to uphold principles of democracy, which most people in the room, actually everyone will agree is a good thing, because everyone likes freedom of speech, everyone likes civil liberties. We're not guaranteed this under dictatorship. This is why we say it pertains to a group of people, and we find that most democracies are very forgiving and want to uplift people who are in war and in times of chemical warfare in other countries. Yeah. And then the last point I'm going to respond to is this point on efficacy and how there's a really big mechanistic jump we get from first off. They tell us that democracies pertain to the will of the people, as I said, and that dictators have power and no accountability. Example, Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia. And because of those examples, we can clearly see that they don't work and they continue to be bad. We get no mechanisms on why they work, and we don't get mechanisms on why they're the most impactful examples we should consider. We see countries like Libya, we see countries like Syria, we see how it's sanctions, even Iraq, sanctions have worked there, and how sanctions continue to work there to prevent further harm to the people. We don't understand why we should, we just don't get any mechanisms from side of. So therefore, we see that this, argument's premise just doesn't fulfill itself because of that lack of recognition. And the harm that does to their case is that currently they have no standing points, and already on that alone, we as are winning. Any POIs? No. Okay, cool. So I'm going to begin onto my argument about legitimacy, and the premise of this argument is that we think that even in situations where sanctions do not work, there are still a justified form of international power. Okay, cool. So two things we have to characterize just to make this argument clear. So sovereignty. sovereignty is like the nation's right to rule itself. So for example, the government, their own way of conducting, so on and so forth. And we think that hard in alone international relations conflicts is that people feel that their sovereignty is threatened, or that people feel like they can't enact their own sovereignty in solving issues. We see this like 100 years ago when we say, we're going to war, or we want you, example, Zimbabwe to change the way you act, and they conclude it like war. Then we see like democracies, and like I already characterized this because to respond to their argument, but democracies are populist in nature, and most people in most democracies want to uplift the principles of democracies. This is like democracy listening to people saying like, we don't like the way that Israel is like conducting its like stuff, for example, against Africa, and its African government further on going to like tell Israel at the ICJ, we want to I don't know, to arrest you, do sanctions, whatever. That's an example of that. And then in the beginning I said like economic capacity is also a very important thing to consider here. Because as a part of sovereignty, when your economic capacity is limited, that's already a threat to you, because that directly impacts your way of conducting yourself as the world has shifted from being militaristic to more like trade and economic, right? Cool. The mechanisms of this argument. Sanctions are not a direct attack on sovereignty, they're an attack on actions and nature that that country does. So instead of saying we're going to war with China, we say we impose sanctions on China because of this. Because war and other methods like tariffs can feel very vague and very vague. But when we have sanctions, we're able to properly impose a type of sanction and like impose it in the way that we want it. Secondly, to create a political precedent. So let's say the sanction doesn't work, worst case scenario. We set the precedent that like, we don't like this country, we want things to change. For example, when South Africa spoke up against Israel, other countries started listening, other countries started shifting their ways. Even if it wasn't big, they started shifting. Secondly, collectivization in international relations. Sure, we have bodies like the UN, but when we have more countries coming together to sanction a country, we think that we have more power in taking away the economic capacity of that country. And secondly, they're more manipulatable. And sure, this sounds like a bad thing, but when you want someone to change their actions, you want to have some sort of power to change. What's the impact of this? You're better able to enact stability in these countries, even if it is not the largest amount of stability. We can at least guarantee you that these countries will have an incentive to change in the long run. Because even if we create vulnerable groups on both our sides, we're better off on the alternative as we value uplifting people and being able to change bad situations than just forcing them into these situations with their government.
Okay, thank you for that speech. Can you please hold the second speaker outside?
Then we get this idea, okay, what is the effectiveness of sanctions?
they inform people, they help like bring forth sort of change within countries, right? So we think that this is not a very fair thing to say, because as my first speaker has proved already, is the fact that sanctions harm, if you put sanctions on a country, right, what this does is that whatever the country is sanctioning another country, this will cause like a mutual harm to each country, if you understand what I'm saying, right? So essentially, if you sanction a country, right, you're causing tension between that country, right? You don't tell them beforehand, okay, you don't be like stupid and say, okay, I'm going forward. You say like, okay, I'm going to put a little economic sanction on you. What this causes is animosity, it causes a lot of tension, right? Therefore, they're less likely to want to come to a peace agreement or peace negotiations with each other, right? Why is this bad? It's because you don't actually get to a solution to this problem, right? You get that you have these long-term benefits, but we don't see any way that this is actually going to solve itself at some point, right? We think that they're less likely or willing to be able to reach an agreement, and we think that they're going to resort to very unethical ways of coming to an end to this agreement, right? Which I'll get to in my point, right? We think that, again, we think that we have to prove to why dictatorships don't have accountability, right? We get this kind of issue on, do dictatorships have accountability to their people? Do they listen to their people, right? And let me tell you, the reason why dictatorships don't necessarily, are not necessarily held accountable to their people is because they don't need their people's approval to be in power, right? The reasons why democracies listen to their people is because of the fact that they don't need because they do need their people to be in support of them for them to stay in power. That is the reason why democracies listen to their people and listen to what the will of their people and what the people want, right? So we think that in a dictatorship, there is no incentive for them to actually want to listen to what these people say, right? We don't think propaganda is enough mechanization to that because it's obviously in a different nature. We think that listening to their people means that they take into account what these people want and what these people need, right? We think that that doesn't happen a lot in dictatorship because their incentives are to have power or to keep power. We don't think their incentives are to make sure that people in their country, not right now, are okay or are okay, right? So then we get this idea that, okay, sanctions inform people, right? They're very effective because of the fact that you get different types of sanctions, and if a country puts a sanction on another country, it kind of creates this awareness throughout other countries that there are sanctions on this place, right? We think that this is not true because it's not a mutually beneficial thing. Like, it's not only beneficial to sanctions. We think that peace negotiations, we think that war, the other things like that also inform people of what's going on. We don't think, oh, it's just another benefit. Now, I'm going straight on to my point because it's important. My point is about de-dollarization, right? And this is a very important thing that could happen if something like this comes into place, right? So if we take the example of the US, and let's say they're sanctioning something like China or Russia, right? Because this is relevant to status quo, they would likely be sanctioning countries like this, right? So let's use that example, right? We see that international trade as a whole is done in dollars, right? Because the dollar is extremely powerful, right? Everything is done in dollars. And so we see that this gives the US authority to freeze assets of other countries because they have control rights and things like that in the country, right? So we see that this gives them, obviously we see that freezing assets is the most effective way of using sanctions, right? Because it has the biggest economic impact on a country, right? So we see that the US can freeze assets of these countries, right? Basically, so what the US is going to do is it's going to use this method to create sort of a boundary on that country, right? And what happens then is that these sanctions are used excessively, right? And when that happens, the country that is being sanctioned are going to realize, okay, this is having a huge effect on me and the assets that I have, and so I'm going to have a huge reaction because this is all I can resort to, right? And so once they realize, okay, this is like the best I can do is resort to something, they're going to resort to creating a new currency, right? What happens here is that for example, like Russia or China, they'll find that there's not a lot of ways for them to compete, so they're going to create a currency so that they can keep their assets, right? So that their assets are not frozen anymore. So once they have this new currency, right, to combat the US's dominance in international trade, we can see this as an example in BRICS, right? BRICS have already been in discussion of doing something like this, right? Of creating their own currency to combat the US, right? So we think that this is legitimate to say. And so we see that this shows you why it's likely that something like that will occur. And even if it's not, it's very detrimental, and that's why we'd like to avoid it altogether. It's likely because these countries will feel that there's a necessity to do something, because the US is freezing the assets, right? Otherwise, they'll obviously lose a lot of money. So what does it look like when a new currency is made? This will likely be an external currency, right? Not a pre-existing one from a country, right? This currency will then challenge the dollar, right? Eventually weakening it and lowering the demand of the dollar, right? Because when a new currency is coming in, it becomes a standard international way, right? And so this will weaken the demand. demand and control of the dollar over international trade, right? The dollar's demand will drop. Therefore, what's going to happen is the economy is going to become shaky, right? What happens is the economy has to be very stable, right? The reason why we use dollars right now is because they have a very high demand, right? And so they are able to stay afloat. But when you have a new currency that doesn't necessarily have a guarantee of this, we don't see that it's going to uphold, right? Then we have why though is it unlikely that this new currency will succeed, right? We have another layer of analysis on this. They won't be able to sustain the global economy. Because if we look at the nature of new currencies and why they're so unpredictable, we can look at things like Bitcoin, right? And we can look at why new currencies that have been attempted to be produced, they're extremely unreliable because they fluctuate, because they don't necessarily stay the same, and because they cannot be sustained, right? And so we see that the same thing could happen with this new currency, right? It's unlikely to be able to support global trade, and we think that it's due to that unpredictability, as well as the demand, right? Because we said that the reason that the dollar has been so sustained is because it has had enough demand, right? While this country's demand is not guaranteed to be so good. What does this mean for this debate, and what does it mean that this is such a big global impact, right? Due to obviously the concerns in sustainability and structure in this new currency, it's likely that it's going to crash, right? And I've used my example of Bitcoin, it crashed. So this one is likely also going to crash, right? It'll have a huge effect on the global economy if this crashes, right? Economics obviously are very important in upholding international trade, right? We think that international trade is very important because this is what we're obviously the main contention in today's debate, right? It needs to be stable, otherwise a lot of people could lose a lot of money, there could be financial crises, etc. And so we think that the impact of this is that we don't obviously want the economy to crash, and you can't risk having overuse of sanctions because this is what it could lead to, right? It could lead to this increasingly big harm. It's way too big for us to consider even using sanctions as a primary tool to anything because of the fact that once you overuse something like this, a big thing like this could happen. Thank you.
Right, and speak, could we please call the third speaker of the side problem?
Are you making my speech? Sorry. I'm Siddhi Pranashila. I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we use sanctions when countries are actively abusing their citizens in terms of their human rights and their ability to extend those rights, right? We don't think that this this debate has turned into a little bit of a mess, so I'm going to try and set this up. First, I'll be doing some strategic thoughts. Secondly, I'll be doing a little bit of piece of rebuttal. The majority of it will be done in my classes. And lastly, I'll be doing a way up of this entire debate. So first, let's talk about the strategic thoughts that we find throughout the position space. Firstly, this idea that we're only talking about in the first week of it, they contradict themselves. This idea that we're only going to talk about sanctions and that sanctions are going to be the only thing used. Clarification in your panel, we're saying it's a primary tool, and they all acknowledge this, but then they're also going to debate our case as if we're only going to use sanctions ever in any certain case. We think that we can acknowledge that yes, there are going to be moments when you're going to use a sanction, and then next thing you know, it's actually working, we're going to resort to another method. We don't think our side is not going to do that. Secondly, this weird thing about what they're having to prove and not to prove. Panel, this is a this house supports debate, not a this house supports debate. What does that mean? It means that it's not sufficient enough for opposition to come here and tell you why sanctions don't work as a primary tool only. They need to tell us why alternatives are 10 times better or more likely going to be working in favor of their side over these sanctions. What does this ultimately mean? It means that they're arguing the wrong debate, and they can't tell us why on their side of the house they're likely to achieve any of the benefits that they even claim here, right? And lastly, this idea of no mechanization whatsoever. Panel, we're busy talking about de-dollarization, and then we're jumping to the next the impact, where there's no mechanization, no explanation as to how this is going to happen, when this is going to happen, and how this actually affects countries in terms of sanctions, and why that's an alternate alternative next go into some like rebuttal on what both sides have to say. Yeah. So firstly, this idea of like dictatorships and democracies, right? And how we're unlikely going to be using that goes into my first class, right? Of effectiveness, right? Opposition one firstly tell me that it's going to be more likely to harm the normal actor because of the fact that dictatorships have no accountability to the people. A couple of responses to this. Firstly, we think that actually sanctions is a global statement to the world that hey, this country is doing something that's really bad. I don't think any of you guys should be supporting that. What does that bring? It brings the accountability that the people in that country cannot have. That means that when the whole entire world is seeing that, when we talk about like secondary sanctions, for example, when other countries that are like sanctioning, for example, Syria, who's using chemical weapons, and then the US is like sanctioning another country, what does that ultimately mean? It means that when all these other countries are not like trading with this country, it brings that form of accountability to change your ways, the ones that lack the people. So actually, our side is fixing this problem that they're telling you dictatorships, and not their own side, right? Secondly, it doesn't actually talk about like this idea, or they do not speak this idea that we're more likely to have coordination of sanctions on our side. When we talk about coordination, we're talking about the fact that multiple countries are likely going to sanction the same place due to the secondary countries. Let's think about it this way. If US is like sanctioning Russia, and then I'm still trading with Russia as India, and then the US is like, I don't like how you're still trading with them, let's sanction you too. Now what's India going to do? I'm going to stop trade. What does this do? It puts more pressure on Russia to stop doing what they're doing. This ultimately means, on our side, what does that mean in terms of effectiveness? First, we're more likely going to be uplifting the citizens' rights and bettering their lives by bringing this accountability. Note here, panel, that the people that are oftentimes in these situations cannot do anything, like boycotting, for example, in that country because of the fact of this lack of accountability, right? That's why we think that this primary tool is likely going to uplift those individuals. But secondly, we're likely going to be having other participants within the sanctioning itself, aka other countries. So therefore, these countries are less likely going to continue their humanitarian issues, right? Now, the second thing about legitimacy, the second hash about legitimacy. Opposition are trying to tell you that it's not legitimate because you're likely going to have de-dollarization, right? In terms of, okay, when we sanction individuals, now new currency is going to be made because I'm being sanctioned. First, no mechanization as to why that's likely to happen, but secondly, it's kind of on the assumption that they have experts to be creating these new currencies in the first place, but for some reason, we're not allowed to have experts that know what countries to sanction. We think, again, if we're going to be on that basis, both of us have experts, but what do we mean? Why do we tell you that, we are likely the better side? Firstly, we don't think countries are likely that are going to be making these new currencies in the first place because they're third world and they rely on these first world countries in the first place for trade. We think that takes a long time in the first place and a lot of power to even get your country off the ground. We see this in the fact of the USA. It took them really long time to even have it as a primary trading currency thing. So we don't there's no mechanization as to why it's actually going to be happening, right? But secondly, we don't think that there's a legitimate reason to not sanction countries in the terms of they're going to just make a new currency. Because if you see that people's rights are actively being harmed and people are not even having access to their own currencies, you're actually just worsening the situation because you're firstly providing a currency that's not even legit. So now the people are less likely going to be able to fend for themselves or to even have access to these rights that we so desperately want on both sides of the house, right? But secondly, yeah, there's that. So before I move on to what opposition has said, are there any POIs on the floor? Okay, cool. So what does that mean in terms of our legitimacy on our side of the house, and why do we think that we're more likely going to have that legitimacy? Okay, so firstly, we tell you that because firstly, we're maintaining sovereignty within a country, right? They don't respond to this whatsoever, her panel, please note that. Because it's a form of, when you sanction a country, you're not immediately invading them, which is the alternative, right? We think that the alternative is directly going into countries or trying to arrest the individuals, but we see that this doesn't happen because firstly, invasion is more likely going to carry out more collateral damage for the civilians, which is more likely going to more harmful than a sanction. But secondly, we think that we're less likely going to trigger a country to just be even worse in terms of what they do to their citizens. Because let's be real, if it's random country just coming into my country, I'm going to be heck no, I'm going to fight you back. And what does that mean? More people are going to be blown up.
right? And lastly, yeah, we're more likely to uplift people. And with that, I finish my speech. Thank you.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Caitlin. Third speaker for opposition, pronoun she, her, her. Yeah. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ultimately, when a side advocates for policy in which it has the potential to destabilize the global economy, we simply cannot support that side, so proud to oppose. A few things in my speech today. First, I'll be looking at some clarifications I would like to make in this debate, moving on to my crashes, and then rebuttal if time permits. First thing I want to clarify is this idea of sovereignty, right? And it's a little bit of rebuttal, but just stay with it, right? We get this idea of sovereignty from Proposition 2nd speaker, right? They tell us that people's sovereignty is better protected when sanctions are put in place. But PROP cannot claim the benefit of sovereignty because all forms of international interference affect people's sovereignty, right? Wars as well as sanctions, right? Therefore, they cannot claim this benefit because all forms of international interference affect people's sovereignty, right? We see that all types of interference into other countries when there's international crises or disputes in relations, they all affect people's freedom, they all affect people's autonomy and how they ultimately live their lives, right? We see that sanctions, furthermore, because of the way in which they work, they are more likely to do more long-term damage to these people, right? When they are so, because the global economy is so fragile, and because of our de-dollarization argument that hasn't been disproven through Prop's third, we see that they're using sanctions as a primary tool to get rid of these countries. We see that it's a long-term, it puts long-term implications on, the actors, right? Moving on to my my other clarifications is that this whole chat about third and first world countries, we see that both countries are affected by sanctions. We don't see why it's relevant to be prioritizing third countries over first world countries. We see them both equally affected by sanctions. More so in third world countries because there's a higher population of vulnerable actors. Okay. Then you spoke about how sanctions are the best means of, and I'll get into this in my caption, but you spoke so highly of sanctions in the manner in which they operate, and spoke to more extremist alternatives when speaking towards our case, which is not true. It's not simply war that is another alternative. There are other methods of interference, and you can't simply just say that. No, I'll take it later. You can't simply state that war is the next alternative. Yeah. Okay, going on to my clashes. So the main clash I found in today's debate was sanctions, effectiveness, versus other methods of international diplomacy. Just to point out to the panel, that proposition was very blindsided and had their blinkers on when they were speaking about their case, because they didn't prove how any of their benefits were unique to their side, inherent, or why other methods of international interference don't achieve the same goal, right? They spoke about how sanctions all types of countries to change, right? So a few things under each point. The first thing being, sanctions are targeted, but this is not an inherent benefit of sanctions, right? We see that other forms of interference are targeted. This doesn't prove how this benefit is unique. We see that other methods can achieve this. It doesn't stand. Secondary sanctions are not a guarantee under sanctions. You can't guarantee the collectivization of other countries coming together to try and mitigate the harm that one country is causing, and you therefore cannot claim the overall benefit. But even if you do, we see that again, sanctions aren't as effective as other forms of international interference. The next thing we spoke about was it places pressure on a country to change, which is again not inherent. Other forms of international interference do this, right? We see that like direct interference, having global press conferences, literally simply stating that you're not standing with this country. It's not a form of economic sanctions, but it also places pressure on countries to now change and fix their things. It's not something special, and we don't see how any of the benefits they claim to have on their side are inherent to their case. We see that the last point they stated under why sanctions are effective is the limitations of economic capacity, especially in terms of dictators, and how it incentivizes countries to change, right? We see that this point doesn't stand simply on the basis of something the first speaker said, how that their side is pretty much the status quo. We see that in the status quo, sanctions aren't 100% effective. We see that they haven't been working out in the long run. But we see that in cases like Israel and Palestine, where sanctions have been imposed, and we don't see any effective change coming out of that, right? Sanctions don't work in the status quo, so I don't understand why you frame your case to be around the status quo. Then from opposition, we gave you the idea of other methods of international diplomacy, right? So like negotiation, ceasefire, military interventions, and how dictators need to be targeted by a primary tool, and in which that primary tool can't be sanctions because they don't work, because dictators have no accountability to their people, and sanctions are targeted to the people, right? The whole idea about sovereignty doesn't stand because you are directly targeting the people in terms of sanctions, because they directly impact people's quality of life, right? So then we saw that we also gave the idea that dictators are the most harmful because they are the most unaccounted for and they hold the largest power, right? And we see that in dictator situations, you are sanctioning the people, and it doesn't necessarily directly place any pressure on a dictator to change one. But in democracies, we see everyone suffering, and under a democratic government, we see that sanctions still necessarily won't come out of any benefits that other means of international interference won't prove. We don't see why we should prioritize this as the primary tool of international interference. Yeah?
As the demand falls under sanctions, therefore prices fall. Do you think dictators want less money? This is why in the short run we don't see sanctions lasting 20 years. Example, Zimbabwe.
We don't see how sanctions we see how sanctions in the long run will affect the global economy. We see how that directly impacts your most vulnerable actor. We don't understand how this has any effect to hold dictators accountable, and we therefore don't see change in dictator economies. We don't understand why sanctions should be used as a primary tool. The second thing opposition brought to you today was the idea that the sanctions also affect democracies, right? So imposing sanctions, which will be done if they're the primary tool of international affairs, burn off the soft power, and it's unlikely that countries will want to trade with each other. So this creates a lack of global power, and causes harm to the most vulnerable actor. It's mutually harmful to those imposing and receiving, because it hurts both sides of the relationship. Then just one quick point of rebuttal before I go. No, I'll just do my weighing actually. So today I'm going to be weighing. I'll do one factor of weighing, and that is short-term versus long-term benefits. In the short term, we might see economic change in the long term, we see a huge economic downturn due to sanctions, and that's why we can't stand for it. So proud to oppose.
Alright. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2. Side proposition lost this debate the moment that they couldn't prove that dictatorships would be affected by sanctions. Let me tell you why this is so important. As in my first speech, we proved to you that we care about the legitimacy of the effectiveness of these tools on dictatorships because they are the most influential actors on the global scale, right? We've given you examples such as Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia. Even if they are not these massive countries, they still have more power because they do not have accountability to their people, meaning that they don't have any incentive to protect their people, meaning that sanctions would not work because their the primary thing sanctions do is affect people. Right, now let's take a look at the biggest clash of today's debate, which is efficacy. There are 3 points that I'll be speaking. So, proposition comes up here and tells us that these sanctions are going to be used responsibly, they're going to be proportional, and therefore they're going to be effective. That's just the broad outline of the case. Let me tell you why all this is wrong. Firstly, they contradicted themselves by acknowledging the legitimacy of responses to certain things that the countries do is subjective to countries, which allows a very real opportunity for irresponsible use. What is the result of this? De-dollarization, as my second speaker has brought up. And either way, it creates an unreliable, unstable economy, which ultimately is a large harm to the most global actor, as it is very likely if sanctions are used as the primary tool, and therefore are used a lot, because there are lots of conflicts, there are lots of conflicts of interest, and if sanctions are used left, right, and center for all of those, it is likely that they are going to be used unreliably because they are used so much. Right, secondly, they have not spoken about how long it actually takes for sanctions to be put in place. This is a minimum of 2 to 3 years, panel. Do you know how much can happen in 2 to 3 years? The invasion of Gaza, of Israel, happened 2 years ago. So much has happened over those 2 years. If, say, we'd imposed sanctions when this was started, this much would have happened by the time we are here now. This is not okay. We are not willing to risk 3 years of unchecked violence in places such as war zones, just because, oh no, we think sanctions might work next year. No, if you have a patient who is dying, who has 8 hours to live, you are not going to run a 6-hour test. You are going to run a 30-minute test and an hour test. You are going to run absolutely everything you can to try and find if there is a better solution. This is what we do on side opposition. Yes, they say that, oh no, but if the sanctions don't work, we have other opportunities. Yes, we do too. It's just way more effective because we are trying the ones that take a shorter time to implement and a shorter time to see if they are going to work. We are going to intervene militarily, and if that doesn't work, then we go to try negotiations. We're going to negotiate peace talks, ceasefires. And then if these don't work, then we'll go to sanctions. And then we can try this and that. But the stuff that works over a long period of time should not be the one that we are imposing immediately, because they need immediate help. The most vulnerable actor needs immediate help, and sanctions are not giving them this, right? And then finally, they have not spoken about dictatorships, right? As I've already told you, dictatorships are a very important part of this debate because they are the ones that will go unchecked. They are the ones that can cause the most harm because they are going unchecked. If we have a tool that does not affect them and they are not affected by it, right? If not immediately, because democracies, yes, they are going to see, okay, this is going to be detrimental to my people. Like, before it actually becomes detrimental to my people, let's change something because they care about that. Dictatorships are not going to look at that. They're going to go all the way up until the 3-year point before they even consider doing anything because they don't care about what happens at that 3-year point. They don't care about what happens to their people. They don't care if they can't afford trousers. They don't care if they can't afford food. What they care about is gaining power, gaining influence, and they're going to do whatever it takes to get that. And this is through escalation of war. This results in the next clash, which is basically just an impact of this, which is the harms to the actors. This harms, these sanctions harm the people in these dictatorships, harm the most vulnerable actor, harm the people, might I say, dictatorships are mainly in South Africa, and not in Africa. These are third world countries, these are who they are targeting. They are not benefiting them because they are not actually imposing something that will affect them.
All right, thank you for that speech. Could you please get the proposition reply to conclude our debate?
why should we prioritize other things? Side opposition did their best, and they made an effort to prove to us why sanctions should not be a priority. But they did not prove to us, or did not even try to make it. They made a minor effort in the last part of their third speaker to tell us why maybe we should prioritize other things. They spent the major part of their argument trying and failing to tell us why we think they think that sanctions shouldn't be the priority. One of their main arguments regarding this was the idea of long-term versus short-term. We just got this from the reply speaking force. They explained to us that because sanctions are a long-term solution, we want solutions that come in now. We want solutions that come in now, and that's why we prioritize them. However, then, in our first speaker speech, we give you examples of what these solutions look like, and we tell you why these solutions do not work. We can tell you that these often result in long wars, they often end up hurting all of our civilians more, right? So, in response, opposition doesn't give us very much. They give us the most that we get out of them in response to the idea that we should try and do things like, they give us boycotting. When they tell us specifically that a dictatorship won't listen, how will a dictatorship listen to boycotting happening within its own country? That brings me to our next class, right? Dictatorships and the identification of dictatorships, right? They identify dictatorship as places where they do not care about the value of the input of their people at all. They do not care about their people at all. But we need to understand, as stated in our second third speech, dictatorships are made up of the people. We gave you a plan, we brought up the idea of propaganda. There's a reason these people come into power. They come into power through ideas like propaganda. They come into power through these things which we mentioned in our speeches, right? That is how they come into power. They rely on people to gain that power and then use that power to control them, right? So therefore we understand that there's ideas for them. Then we get on to our next clash. Our next clash for this would be the values and the idea of the legitimacy of these sanctions and whether the sanctions that we give are any. We understand that war and sanctions are separate things and they result in separate things. So therefore asking this kill eye of whether we give wars are legitimate is still separate. While we can find parallels, we still identify it as a separate topic to what sanctions are and how sanctions affect things, right? We talked about this in our second speaking speech. We also talked about in our second speech, we talked about democracy and democracy values, right? We understand that democracies are more likely to be the basis putting on these sanctions based on the clarification we made in our first speaking speech, to which said opposition conceded, right? These democratic values are the values that promote human rights, that promote freedom of speech, and that's why we believe these are inherently good values and are moral values that should not be argued whether these are good or bad, right? So therefore we think we take that path, we prove to you the effectiveness of these things through the idea of sanctions like that. Again, the robustness we get is very little with very low mechanisms, right? Well, again, we mentioned this throughout our speech, but one of the things we find is that we can get a lot of mechanisms from things. Side opposition. Then we did the idea of new currencies, right? They said that in response to new currencies would be created, which is really silly to me because it's the idea that you know more. If you can see, we talked about professions, we talked about how professionals. If you, as a 16-year-old girl, can tell that a currency is going to crash, then surely the person who is making this new currency can say, oh, well, I think this is going to crash because I'm a third world country and I don't know.
All right, thank you to the speakers. I'd like to invite the teams to cross the floor and stand. The panel will be outside.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Right, so I think, especially considering the comparative debate, there's not much discussion about, okay, this is how sanctions are effective, but this is what alternatives look like, and why alternatives broadly either are effective or are not effective, right? But on this idea about efficacy, right, we appreciate this push and this idea from proposition and how sort of sanctions can do all of these things to harm the country, right? But at the end of the day, when we're speaking about changing policy, we think that the contention for opposition, that because of their structure, these kinds of governments that are doing things wrong, that we want to punish, because their incentive is to maintain power, they're not likely to listen to sanctions, right? The people in the country that sanctions will be hurting are not the people making the decisions, right? So lastly then, I think the best sort of defense against this claim, or red proposition, is this idea that if we do major economic damage, right, because of dictators' positions of power, right, they are likely still to care, right? So then, to kind of work this out, I think it's about who mechanizes the incentives the best, right? I think that based on opposition's framing and how they delve into the incentives of dictators and why they wouldn't listen, right? We think that that is mechanized better on their side than the mechanization about why, because of their incentives to have hold of power, they will care about the impact of sanctions, right? So we think on that basis, in terms of discussing the efficacy, opposition is able to blunt the proposition's attack by saying that, cool, even if these are effective at doing damage, we still think that the people in charge of these countries and making these harmful policies won't care and won't change their policies. And so, again, the debate going to opposition. If anyone wants to ask a personal feedback, please ask one of the two hands.